For America, peak Prius happened back in 2012 when Toyota sold over 230,000 Prius family vehicles. There was actually some concern in the industry that the Prius would soon outsell the Toyota Camry. But in reality, that never happened, and in fact, Prius sales overall in America are down to just about the same levels that we had in 2004. Why is that, and should you be looking at something like this refreshed 2020 Prius Prime, or should you be looking at some of the other electrified alternatives? The Prius Prime is arguably the most efficient Prius available in America. Sure, the Prius L Eco, the non-plug-in version, gets a slightly higher MPG score, but this gets also 133 mpge when running on electricity, and for a lot of folks that is the greater efficiency metric. And if you take a look at this just as an EV, this is really the second most efficient EV available pretty much anywhere in the world. The only vehicle in the US that will top this in terms of MPGe efficiency is the most efficient trim of the Model 3. But of course, the Prius is not a Model 3 competitor. It's not even anywhere close, because Toyota's mission when designing the Prius Prime was very, very different, and it centered entirely on efficiency. And in my opinion, that's really the reason that Prius Prime and Prius sales in general haven't quite lived up to some of their expectations. This is the rational man's vehicle. Toyota focused on high efficiency, engineering precision, reliability, longevity, all those sorts of things that it just seems like customers don't seem to care as much about. It turns out that the average green shopper in America is more interested in brand, performance, and in some ways EV range over efficiency. In this video, we are going to be talking about the Prius Prime for 2020, but we're also going to be talking about this question of efficiency versus range, plug-in hybrid versus EV, regular hybrid versus plug-in hybrid. The key thing to know about the Prius Prime is that it's a pretty good deal in America at the moment. We still get a federal tax credit on this because Toyota has not sold as many plug-in hybrids or EVs as someone like General Motors or Tesla, whose EV tax credits have essentially sunsetted. This is about $2,200 more in base form than a non-plug-in Prius, $27,750 starting. And if you're looking at the top-end limited trim like we are here, this is only $1,100 more than the limited trim without the plug. So if you're shopping for a Prius in America, in my opinion, the Prius Prime really ought to be the one on your shopping list. It also should be on your shopping list if you're worried about operational expenses. On the outside, I think the Prime is the most attractive Prius available in America. We have a slightly more sedan-shaped profile than we find in the regular Prius, and this is about 3 inches longer as well. We still have a liftback, so we still have a lot of cargo practicality, but we have a much smaller cargo area because we have a battery that's nearly 9 times larger. Overall cargo capacity goes from just over 27 cubic feet to just under 20 cubic feet. So we do lose almost a third of the cargo room, but we gain the slightly more attractive rear end overall. The important thing to remember about the Prius line in general, and the Prius Prime specifically, is that Toyota's focus on overall efficiency really rules the entire design for this vehicle. It defined the shape of the Prius, the tire size, the amount of power we have under the hood, and the battery pack in the rear as well. Under here we have basically the same engine that we find in the regular Prius. It's a 1.8-liter four-cylinder engine. On its own, it produces 95 horsepower and 105 pound-feet of torque. It's then mated to a hybrid synergy drive transaxle up front. The most important thing to remember about Toyota's hybrid system is that this is not a CVT like most people think out there. So the overall design of the system bears zero resemblance at all to the CVTs that we find under the hoods of Subarus or Nissans or even something like a Toyota Corolla. It is completely different. At the heart of this system, there's a single planetary gear set and 2 motor generator units. That's what allows the system to either operate as a conventional driving vehicle. It's going to use those 2 motor generator units to act as a transmission that can change ratios, or it can just use those electric motors to drive the vehicle down the road in EV mode. Now, unlike the regular Prius, this vehicle will use both electric motors to help motivate the Prius Prime down the road, giving us a theoretical maximum of about 100 horsepower or so when in EV mode. If you're operating in hybrid mode, then we get a bit more because the engine can add to it about 121 total. Oddly enough, the Prius Prime will get slightly better fuel economy than the regular Prius, 54 miles per gallon combined when operating as a regular hybrid versus 52 miles per gallon combined for the comparable non-plug-in Prius. Now, there is a slightly higher fuel economy base Prius, but that's not the direct corollary to the models and trims, feature set, etc. that we're looking at right here. The two main reasons for improved fuel efficiency versus the regular Prius are the overall profile. This seems to be a little bit slipperier because of the different look out the back. And of course, the battery pack in the rear. This is an 8.8 kilowatt hour lithium-ion battery pack located right there under the cargo area. It's about 8 or 9 times larger than the pack that we find in the regular Prius. According to the EPA, that makes this battery good for about 25 miles of EV-only range. Now, at this point in time, I know that a lot of you are thinking 25 miles seems useless. Why bother even making a plug-in vehicle with this kind of range? When you take a look at the numbers, you can really see what Toyota was focused on. Real-world driving range, the average American commutes less than 25 miles a day, as well as efficiency, as I said before, because at 133 mpge, only a single trim of the Model 3 in America will get better overall efficiency than this particular vehicle. And remember that the Model 3 is not lugging around a gasoline engine, so it's going to be a little bit more aerodynamic than this overall shape, which does have more cooling demands going on up front. And obviously, when operating as a hybrid, this is going to get 54 mpg. This is not the same kind of balancing act that we saw with the Chevy Volt. The Volt was trying to be everything to everyone. It was trying to give us a very long EV range, relatively speaking, for the time, and of course give us gasoline range as well. But it ended up being ultimately compromised with poor efficiency on both sides because of that particular choice. Charging happens back here via this charge door. We have a little cap over the J1772 port, but one thing I noted is that there's really nowhere to hook this. It seems like there's a hook over there, but it actually pulls out from its little retaining clip if you try and use that. You can't actually park that anywhere, really. It just is left to dangle onto the paint. And then we have an included emergency charge connector. This is only going to operate on 110 volts. Of course, the vehicle will charge on 240 as well to give you that 25 miles of electric range. Charging should take under 3 hours if you're charging on a 240 volt level 2 station. It'll obviously take probably about 7 hours or so if you only have access to 110 volts and that emergency charger in the back. When it comes to the sales numbers, clearly there's a lot of internal competition going on. That's part of why the Prius isn't selling as well. There's also external competition. There are a ton of different hybrids and plug-in hybrids available in America now. But I also think there's something different going on here. A lot of Americans have forgotten that the Prius is all about efficiency, and if you want to save money and reduce emissions, then efficiency is incredibly important. Unless you're getting all of your power from a truly zero-emission source and you have a truly unlimited quantity of that power, then relative efficiency should be important to just about every green shopper out there. But a lot of folks are buying other vehicles that have much lower efficiency ratings and theoretically could have higher emissions overall than the Prius here, certainly will have higher operational costs as well. This Prius, to drive 25 miles, will cost you $1.06, even at California's high electricity rates. Something like a Tesla Model 3, the most efficient version available, is only going to be 4 cents cheaper to drive 25 miles. And remember, this vehicle starts at $27,000. It will have a federal tax credit on it as well. The Model 3 is going to be an awful lot more expensive than this, and that's not the Model 3 that a lot of green shoppers have moved to. Remember back when the Prius first launched in America, there were tons of Hollywood stars that were out there buying the first model Prius. They were focused on the green image, etc. A lot of those people have moved on to Tesla Model 3 performance models, or Model S performances, Model X performance models, etc. And those are going to be a lot less efficient than the Prius here, and have higher operational costs. According to the EPA, on gasoline and electricity, this should cost the average consumer in America about $800 a year. Theoretically, a Model 3 could save you perhaps $200 a year, and overall emissions would be a little bit higher than this than in the Model 3 if you're just talking about the consumption on the vehicle. Now, if you're talking holistic emissions, then overall the Model 3 is going to be a little bit higher. I'll let you dive into those videos. There are a number of really great videos about overall holistic efficiency numbers. The Prius, generally speaking, is going to be a little bit lower than some of those, depending on the amount of driving you do in EV mode. But any way you slice it, this is going to be about half the price to operate every year versus a Toyota Corolla, and it's going to consume significantly less gasoline. The average Corolla or Honda Civic out on the road is going to consume about 450 to 500 gallons of gasoline a year. Now, very clearly, if you moved from one of those to a full EV, you could drop that down to 0. And if you moved from one of those options into a Prius Prime, you wouldn't go to 0, but you could get pretty close, relatively speaking. So moving to a vehicle like this is all about efficiency as well as sort of gasoline mitigation, if you want to take a look at it this way. Rather than going cold turkey, there's an argument that you can have a greater environmental impact by taking the same number of batteries that it would take to have 100,000 full EVs out on the road and instead make 300,000 plug-in hybrids, because this Prius Prime, according to the EPA, on the average driver scale, should be consuming about 30 gallons a year versus 450 to 500 in a Toyota Corolla. Well, that may not be zero. That number is significantly lower because the average American should spend at least 90% of their time in EV mode. And even in my relatively odd commute, where I drive up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass and I drive 28 miles each way to the office, I still spent 90% of my time in EV mode in this Prius Prime. So it's all about efficiency with this vehicle. Now the trouble, of course, is that efficiency is just not sexy. With some plug-in hybrids out there, if you were to floor the vehicle, it will turn on the gasoline engine to give you the best acceleration possible. But because there's really not too big of a difference in terms of overall EV horsepower and hybrid horsepower, Toyota elects two different modes for you. We can have it in EV mode where it will not turn on the gasoline engine and then we'll go 0 to 60 in 12.8 seconds. Or we can put it in hybrid mode, get 0 to 60 in 10.3. Remember, this is about 300 pounds heavier than a regular Prius. And the last mode is EV Auto, that has that separate button there in the center console. If we put the vehicle into EV Auto mode and we floor it, then it will stay in EV mode at the beginning and then shift to hybrid mode if you keep the pedal floored for just a little bit longer. In terms of stopping distances, all versions of the Prius Prime that we've tested so far stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 127 feet. This is a little long for the compact segment, but remember, the Prius Prime is on the heavy end as well because we have that much bigger battery pack in the rear. We also don't have tires as wide as some of the top-end options in the non-hybrid competition. So if we're taking a look at an Elantra Sport or a Civic or even top-end versions of the Corolla, the tire sizes and the tire compound choices on the Prius are just not quite as grippy. Now, logically, we have to go back to the EV competition talk for a while because clearly a Tesla Model 3 is going to be more fun to drive out on the road than this. Clearly, a hybrid Camry is going to be more fun to drive out on the road than this as well. It has significantly more power, nearly double the horsepower that we have here. It also has slightly wider tires. It's going to hold the road a little bit better. It's going to feel more sporty than the Prius, but it's not going to give you fuel economy that is this good. Same thing goes for a wide variety of plug-in hybrids out there. Because again, the Prius is not about overt driving enjoyment. Even though this generation of the Prius has really made significant strides in terms of overall driving dynamics, it's all about efficiency first. And again, for some reason, oddly enough, efficiency just isn't that sexy. Good example is whenever we have talked about alternative EVs out there, whether it's a Porsche Taycan or a Jaguar I-Pace or an Audi e-tron, and I comment about the relatively low efficiency versus a modern Tesla, folks are like, well, what does that matter? Always struck me as interesting that people are so interested in range, but not terribly interested in efficiency, and relative efficiency is what's costing you money every time you charge your car. And again, high efficiency is what the Prius is all about. And there has been a lot that has been sacrificed on the altar of efficiency, namely performance, also handling. This is not going to handle like some of those EVs out there. Even some of the mid-range mainstream EVs are going to handle a little bit better than this Prius Prime. Now, I think arguably this has a better handling feel to it out on the road than the regular Prius because we do have more weight in the rear. That's improved the overall weight balance. But that doesn't mean that the Prius Prime is going to handle like a Model 3 or a top-end version of the Kia Niro EV, for instance. Toyota's engineers were just frankly willing to sacrifice that in the name of efficiency. Out on a rougher road like we're on here, the softer suspension of the Prius is definitely comfortable. That's something people have noticed about the Prius lineup for a long time, is that this still gives us the ride that you would associate with probably a slightly larger, more classic American vehicle. There's definitely a little bit more tip and dive, a little bit more body roll than we find in something like a Honda Civic, even though this is about the same size overall as the Civic and Corolla. It's not too far off the average compact stand in America. So if you're looking for a practical, efficient vehicle that rides like a bigger car, then the Prius should definitely be on your list. We also get more cabin noise in here because we don't have as much sound deadening as we find in some of those other green alternatives out there. 74.5 decibels is what we scored in this at 50 miles an hour. Now at this point, a number of you are probably thinking, but hang on a minute, how is it that this matches some of those most efficient EVs out there but does not exceed them, even though we don't have the sound deadening, we don't have the acceleration, we don't have any of that going on? It's all about the range that we have in this vehicle and the fact that we have that range delivered by a gasoline engine. The gasoline engine components obviously add weight, and there's a relative efficiency trade-off in the overall drivetrain design. We have those two electric motor generator units under there, not just one electric motor, which could have been more efficient. And we have the entire weight of the system designed for propelling this vehicle along as a gasoline vehicle as well. And if we're talking about range, the Prius really excels there as well. 640 miles of range in this Prius, on about 11 gallons of gasoline or so. That's the 25 miles of electric range, and the rest is going to be given to you by that 54 mile per gallon hybrid system. And overall range is going to be much more predictable in this, just like in a regular Prius, than in most EVs out there. Obviously, in colder weather, the gasoline drivetrain can be used to generate heat for the cabin. This vehicle will also heat the cabin or cool the cabin via electricity. And we don't have to worry as much about battery conditioning because the battery's use envelope is just very different than in a pure EV. On the other hand, and the absolute bottom line for the Prius out on the road, of course, is that this still drives like a Prius. It's not as inspiring as something like a Model 3 or even some of those other electric alternatives out there from companies who are not named Tesla. It's not going to be as fast as most EVs out there, even relatively inexpensive EVs like a Nissan Leaf Plus. And because a lot of green shoppers don't seem to necessarily factor efficiency into their buying decisions quite as much, it's also going to be a little bit louder in the cabin as well. Front seat comfort is good for a compact vehicle in America. We have a powered driver's seat with a reasonable range of motion, no memory seats even in this top-end trim, no powered passenger seats even in this top-end trim either, but we do have a two-way lumbar support there. We have a tilt telescopic steering column. We have a reasonable range of motion, but the telescoping function does seem a little bit more limited than in some of the competition. Hopping into the back, we have a reasonable amount of rear seat room overall. That's been long one of the best-selling features about the Prius and the Prius Prime. If I put my head all the way back there on the headrest, my hair is touching the ceiling, but my head's not quite touching the ceiling, even though we don't have quite the same profile that we find in the non-plug-in Prius. I still have about 2 inches of overall legroom left. The Prius Prime is, however, a compact vehicle, so if I move over here to the middle, my head does touch the ceiling there, and you'll notice that the rear bench seat is just not as wide as something like a Camry or an Accord. Now, why a Camry or an Accord? Well, because on the inside and in the cargo area, we actually find interior dimensions that are not too far off some of those larger sedans. So like a Camry is not really going to give you that much more legroom. It's definitely not going to give you more headroom or more cargo room than the Prius Prime. The cargo area is also more practical than something like a Camry or your average compact or mid-size sedan because of this lift-back design. If I were to lower these rear seats down, they do fold completely flat, but not flat with the cargo area because of this extra battery. You can put long items right there into the Prius, and we have this entire large opening available. Prius fans have definitely long commented on the incredible cargo practicality that we find in the Prius lineup. That applies to the Prime as well, just in a reduced capacity versus the regular Prius. On the inside, we have height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests. For the green crowd out there, this is imitation leather, not real leather. Moving on over to the front doors, we have a decent amount of hard plastics. Remember, the hard plastics are going to be lighter than a slush molded plastic interior. That's one of the reasons that we find that kind of plastic technology in a lot of efficient vehicles. On the passenger side, we have a reasonably sized glove compartment. This is pretty average for a small car in America. You couldn't fit a larger tablet computer in there. This is not a storage area, that actually just part of the trim over there for the dashboard. In the center of the dash, we have this large screen that we first saw with the Prius Prime. This was one of the first vehicles in America to give us a 12-inch display in the dashboard. We now see them in vehicles like the Outback, the Subaru Legacy, the Ram 1500, and of course, the competition from Tesla, if you're going to consider them competition. Up above that, we have two smaller LCDs in the dashboard. This gives us the instrument cluster readouts, trip computer information. Overall, I have to say that these displays are not as well coordinated as we find in a wide variety of other vehicles out there. This system right here in the middle gives us smartphone integration, something that we didn't see when the Prius Prime first came out. But as you can see, one flaw with that is that the smartphone integration is always going to operate in this very small window up top. This is basically the same thing that we see in the Ram 1500's large display as well as the Subarus. Below that, we can choose whether we want the climate control readouts, or you can also bring up the infotainment readouts right there. So if you're listening to satellite radio, it would be displayed there. Single zone automatic climate control. Again, that's kind of a weight savings thing because a dual zone system would require more baffles, more systems that would increase the weight. Below there, we have controls, park, the shifter right there, and then the control buttons for the EV and hybrid system. You can see that we have a drive mode button here that switches between normal, power, and eco. A button to switch between hybrid and EV modes. If you're in the regular EV mode and you floor it, it will stay in EV mode. It will never turn on the gasoline engine. If you use EV Auto, it will turn on the gasoline engine, and you can switch between the EV and hybrid modes right there by pressing that, or press and hold if you want to charge the traction battery in the rear. Below that, we have a Qi wireless charging mat, heated seat switches, two cup holders right there in the middle, and then a pretty small center console storage area. A classic Prius design trait is that in front of the steering wheel, we really have nothing right there. You are looking right up there at the center of the dashboard for your speed and what else is going on. We have a leather-wrapped steering wheel here. There are controls for the infotainment system over here on the left. There's also a trip button that works that trip computer in that two-screen LCD up there in the center of the dashboard. On the right side of the steering wheel, we have buttons that control that LCD cluster up there. We have a heated steering wheel button, lane keeping assistance, and distance buttons. The rest of the cruise control controls are over here on the stalk. The Prius Prime is definitely a feat of engineering. Toyota has crafted a two-motor drivetrain system that can operate as a transmission for the gasoline engine and give us 54 miles per gallon combined. This is one of the most efficient gasoline vehicles you can buy in America, or it can operate as a pure electric drivetrain, giving us the second most efficient vehicle operating on electricity in America. The downside, of course, is that customers in America don't really seem to be interested in efficiency, as I keep saying. And that's really obvious when you take a look at the sales charts. Vehicles that are less efficient but more fun, like a Tesla Model 3, have definitely stolen the sales crown away from the Toyota Prius, especially this Prius Prime right here. But does that mean that there's no place for the Prius in the world? I would argue that there absolutely is a place for this vehicle still, and that's for someone that's interested in low operational costs, high reliability, and of course, that greener footprint. Because remember, the average compact car in America is going to be consuming about 500 gallons of gasoline, and if you drive this even on the average American drive cycle, you could drop that down to under 50 gallons of gasoline consumed. So that's a serious environmental impact versus the average compact sedan in America. It may not be quite what we see going pure electric, but it's also going to give you fewer compromises. If you don't have the opportunity to charge this Prius Prime at the office or at home one day, it's absolutely not a problem. You still get 600 miles of range thanks to the gas tank. It also is very inexpensive. This vehicle starts at just about $27,000, $28,000. There's still a federal tax credit, which will drive that cost to less expensive than the regular Prius, and definitely in the same price range as many of the alternatives in the compact sedan segment. This is going to be a lot less expensive to operate, however, about $800 in savings versus a Toyota Corolla on a 15,000 mile a year cycle. And because of the very design of this system, it's probably going to be more reliable than that Toyota Corolla as well. And interestingly enough, it is worth noting that overall reliability metrics on the Prius indicate fewer problems in long-term ownership windows than many EVs out there. EVs are definitely very, very simple vehicles, but because most of those EVs are luxury vehicles and they have a lot more systems on them than we find in the Prius, they're not necessarily going to be more reliable in the long run. You also have to worry about what to do with your battery pack as it ages. Maybe it's not going to meet your range windows anymore. If any of that is concerned to you, then again, the Prius Prime is going to be a logical option. This is not going to be exercising as much of its battery pack as a full EV. And of course, if after 300,000 miles, this EV was giving you 10 miles of electric range, it doesn't really matter because it's still going to be backed by that gasoline engine, which is going to give you the full 600 miles of range. Be sure to let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Are you interested in efficiency, or are you interested in a green vehicle that sacrifices efficiency for the fun to drive factor, the performance factor, all those other things that we see going on in the luxury EV segment especially? And it's worth noting again that a lot of those EVs are outselling the Prius. Let me know down there in the comment section below, and I'll see you all next week.